Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Practicing Resilience Practical Steps for DEAI Plans with Dina Bailey of Mountaintop Vision, LLC. Mid America Arts Alliance strengthens and supports artists, cultural organizations, and communities throughout the region and beyond. We are a nonprofit regional arts organization that focuses on strengthening communities and improving lives through extraordinary cultural experiences. We are artists, administrators, historians, preservationists, writers, painters, photographers, and activists. The Engage program provides community centered professional and organizational development that focuses on leadership training for small to mid sized arts and cultural organizations. Using a combination of workshops, coach consultations, and peer to peer learning opportunities, Engage works with participants to govern more effectively, become more fiscally astute, and develop strategies to address community needs. And the community needs Dina Bailey. As the leader of Mountaintop Vision, Dina Bailey has over 15 years of experience in formal and informal learning. She has worked with a variety of clients, such as the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, Guggenheim Museum, and Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. She has a proven record of fostering organizational growth and strengthening institutional infrastructure while resolving multiple and complex challenges. Using a unique approach that combines research in empathy, bias, diversity, equity, and inclusion with strategies and techniques from the field of anthropology and transitional justice, Mountaintop Vision specializes in supporting organizations as they transform themselves into places that consistently center inclusion in decision making and action. Now, on to the workshop.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction and all of the ways that folks can be involved with the Mid-America Arts Alliance. So that is wonderful to hear all of the different avenues. Certainly from my end, just reiterating, if you want to know any more about me, feel free to visit my website at www.mountaintopvisionllc.com. I won't go into all of that stuff with you all today, recognizing in particular that this is part 2. So I've done some of these introductions previously. I see a lot of faces and names out there that I already recognize. So welcome again. Looking forward to being with you in the space today. We'll be doing some practical things here. So I'll review some of the language that we talked about last time. We'll do some things about your purpose, your mission, your vision, your action planning, and try to leave some space there at the end to think about how you can be a leader in very practical ways. All right. So in getting started, I'm going to share my screen. And for those of you who have been with me before, you know that I jump back and forth between sharing my screen and having you all with me. You can, of course, have your camera on, have your camera off. You can write things into the chat box. You can take yourself off mute if there's a particular space when I offer that up. Lots of different ways to be engaged and participate here. So hopefully you will take me up on that offer, and we will jump in and get started, recognizing that here we're talking about practicing resilience, practical steps for your plans. And as we think about those practical steps, again, for those who have been with me before, I always want to start with how we should be in the space together, how I want all of us to work together. And that leads me to the guiding principles. So I think they're very important to say out loud, to recognize, partly from an accessibility standpoint, partly from an intentionality standpoint. So hang with me as I read these for you. The guiding principles, how we will be together for the next couple of hours. Be curious and open. I really believe that curiosity leads to knowledge, knowledge leads to empathy, and empathy leads to action. So being curious and open is really important. Listen for understanding and check your assumptions. A lot of times if we hear something that is new or different or that we haven't agreed with in the past, we just begin to think about our answer to that. Rather than doing that today, I want to make sure that we're really listening for understanding rather than for reply, and that we're checking where our assumptions come from in terms of what should be happening, shouldn't be happening, definitions, all of those things. Recognize that this is not a debate. I have gotten past the point in my career where I'm just willing to debate with folks and win them over to the other side. I really think that it is more about dialogue, that we are here together to share stories and experiences and knowledge in order to learn more about ourselves and each other. So that's the space what I would love for you all to be in today. Be patient and bring your whole selves. I think that sometimes we want to rush forward so that we can do something actionable, check something off the box. I also think that we sometimes, especially in the United States, think that there is a professional self and a personal self. And so really it's important to bring your whole self to this experience. Always, I think, but especially when we're talking about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. Move up, move back. That's a way of saying there are some folks who are external processors, some who are internal processors, better known as extrovert and introvert, perhaps. And so if you are an external processor, you might take up a lot of space in wanting to talk out your ideas or your thoughts or your feelings. For those of you who are internal processors, you may be more inclined to think about those things more silently. We need all types of people here today to be sharing and thinking. And so if you are one who does not always engage in the moment and as directly, I would invite you to move up. If you are one who sometimes takes up a lot of space in terms of external processing, I would invite you to move back. All right. Try to acknowledge when you are uncomfortable. Some of you have probably heard me say before that there needs to be a little bit of discomfort in our learning, that if we are too comfortable, we end up paying attention to other things, what's happening in our inbox, what we have going on this evening. If we are too uncomfortable, then we can only think about that discomfort. So recognize when you are uncomfortable, but please don't let that be something that is a barrier to your learning. And last but not least, be open to changing your mind. That sometimes, especially as adults, we tend to stick to whatever we said first. Think that we have to win that debate, that we have to stand our ground in terms of whatever we said initially. And so really today, just give yourself the opportunity to change your mind if you feel like that is something that you want to do as you've heard others, as you've learned additional information. So again, I think that it's really important that these are the guiding principles that we work toward today for the hours that we are together. And I always want people to acknowledge that they have a choice in this, that there is some accountability that goes along with it. So in the chat box, I would love for you each to write in your acknowledgement of these guiding principles, to say, yes, I will hold myself accountable and others accountable. So if you say yes, that is what you are agreeing to hold yourself accountable to this and others. Great, thank you. I see these coming in already. Perfect. As you all continue to go about doing that, I'm just going to move to my next slide here. This is something that, again, I think is really important to acknowledge and to do. I recognize that some people are more comfortable doing that to a chat with everyone, and some might be just wanting to do it to me. So feel free to send me a private chat if you want. Feel free to say it out loud to everyone if you want. But I think it's really important to go ahead and talk about the lenses through which you see the world. So you have my example there. I am a biracial, straight, cisgender, millennial woman who grew up in the Midwest, lives in the South, and travels the world when I'm not in the middle of a pandemic. You don't have to use the same ones that I did, of course, but just take a few minutes to think about the lenses through which you see the world. What are the multiple identities that you embrace here? So whenever you are ready, please go ahead and put that in the chat box. Again, it could be to everyone, or it could just be to me, but I think it's important to acknowledge and to write out. Just give you a moment here. Thank you, Margaret, for being the first one. Appreciate seeing these coming through. Thank you for sharing, both to everyone as well as those who are just sharing with me. I appreciate starting off with that vulnerability and the courage that it takes. If you've gone ahead and written yours, just go ahead and breeze through everyone else's to acknowledge all of the diversity that we have in this space today, the value of everyone and their lived experiences in this moment. All right, I'm sure that they will continue to come in, but y'all can look at those as I head into my next section here. Again, this is a little bit of a review from last time, recognizing that A, it's just good to reiterate points, and B, it is good for some folks who may or may not have been in the space with me during part one. All right, so the first being our definitions of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. These come from the definitions that AAM has provided. That is in the Facing Change booklet that they have. So if you Google American Alliance of Museums and Facing Change, they have a lot more information, but I will just go ahead here. So diversity, thinking about all of the ways that people are different and therefore the same from an individual and group level perspective. So for some of you, you may have heard me say in a simplistic way, right, that it's like Skittles. Diversity is a way of being, that we are all diverse in different ways. That's part of that multiplicity of identities that we just talked about. I always want to point this out in particular because I think that sometimes we use diversity as a euphemism for Black people or people of color or other specific visual diversity. And so recognizing that diversity is really about all of the differences, learning style, whether you're left-handed or right-handed, lots of different things. The reason that I think that it's so important is because if you see yourself within that framing of diversity, then this is everyone's responsibility. Everyone is a part of making diversity and inclusion a part of the organization. If you don't particularly see yourself as part of that diversity, then there's not that automatic buy-in, right? It's just that you're helping the other. And so this is about all of us rather than an us versus them. When you think about equity, it is the fair and just treatment of all members of a community. When you think about equality, which we sometimes connect with equity or make synonymous, equality is about the fair and just treatment, but giving everyone the same thing. When we talk about equity, we're more so recognizing that people need different resources, need different ways of thinking about priorities, need different time amounts, right? Based on past exclusion in particular. And so as we're thinking about this from an organizational perspective, sometimes we may have given more attention to one particular group, one audience, less attention to other audiences. And so balancing that back out, right? That sometimes it seems weighted in one way or the other just because you're trying to give people resources that perhaps they didn't have before. Access or accessibility, we often think about that in terms of ADA compliance. This goes beyond that. So when we're talking about access or accessibility here, We're talking about giving equitable access to everyone along the continuum of human ability and experience. So not just in terms of physical ability, for example, but it could be in terms of language. It could be in terms of finances. It could be in terms of timing. Again, with our organizations, when are you open? What days are you open? How easy is it to get into your space, right? All of that has to do with access. And then last here on this page, inclusion, the intentional ongoing effort to ensure that diverse individuals fully participate in aspects of organizational work, including decision-making processes. So there's a difference between bringing someone into the room, right, including them in the room, and really being inclusive, which is that intentional ongoing effort to bring folks in and make them a part of that decision-making process. So I wanted to recognize all of those definitions as I'll be using them today, but also as you are thinking about your equity and inclusion plan, your DEAI plan, however, whatever acronym you want to use or whatever order, that you're really thinking with intentionality about what all of those disparate words mean in terms of your actions. Also, recognizing that anti-racism is not the same as diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. It is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. When we think about anti-racism and DEAI, those things are not the same. Right? It may be in your mind that there is a Venn diagram. There are ways in which they align and ways in which they don't. In your mind, it might be that one is inclusive of the other, right? It could be that you see them as completely two separate things. But recognizing that when we are talking about anti-racism, we are particularly talking about race and those systems and policies and procedures in connection to that. The reason that I always bring this up, again, in practicality for your DEAI plan, your equity and inclusion plan, you want to be really intentional in that use of language. So if you want an anti-racism training, for example, it will be about race. So don't come back and say, we didn't talk about sexism, we didn't talk about ageism. If you're doing a DEAI training, for example, you may say, well, why didn't we talk more about race? That's something that's really important in the US right now. So just recognizing that we need to be really intentional in our language and as we're creating our plans. Implicit bias, again, just for shared language purposes, really thinking about how implicit bias is about unconscious manners. Biases are favorable or unfavorable assessments. So sometimes we have that negative connotation, but they can be favorable or unfavorable. They're involuntary, they're without the person's knowledge. And so recognizing that biases and implicit biases are things that we all have. And so as we're thinking about our practical plans, really paying attention to where our gaps might be, that we see things from our own biases, we see things from our own lenses or identities. And that's the importance of really making sure that you have diverse individuals, right, who are included in all of these decisions so that you can help to bridge some of those gaps. All right, this part may be a little bit new for people. And again, I could go and do a whole training about this, but this is just another aspect to what I want to bring to you today. It's called the Four Truths. They come out of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Part of that commission was really about healing the country, and part of healing the country comes with truth-telling. And so as they were thinking about truth-telling, they ended up recognizing 4 different types of truth: forensic truth, personal truth, social truth, and reconciliatory truth. So just very quickly to go through each of these. Forensic truth is what I feel like we are most often comfortable with as public history people, as art folks, right? That we like what we consider to be facts. We like dates, we like times, we like people's names. Those types of things make up forensic truth. And I have that picture there, not necessarily because of the interpretation, but in recognition that there are particular dates and names and things in that as well. Next, we have personal truth. So personal truth are the lived experiences of people, which may actually be part of experiencing someone else's story as well. So when we think about personal truth, it's the memoirs, the diaries, the letters, the moment that you are in a particular place. Sometimes your personal truth may align with forensic truth, and sometimes they may not. And so when we're talking to other people and we keep trying to give them facts, what we consider to be facts, and they keep trying to bring in their experiences, that's when sometimes we have the tension between the two, between forensic truth and personal truth. The third area that I want to talk about is social truth. So social truth are the major narratives that are largely accepted by a societal group, recognizing that that societal group could be about generation, it could be about geography, it could be about religion, it could be about family group. There are lots of ways to make up societal groups. But the point here is that when you have a social truth, it's the thing that people say everybody knows, and yet it's not really that universal. All right, so recognizing that we have a lot of people from a lot of different places here. My general example has been historically in teaching, the North would tend to say that the American Civil War was fought over slavery, right? That is a universal truth. It is a truth that everybody knows. It was fought over slavery. Historically in the South, I would generally say that people have been taught that the American Civil War was primarily about states' rights, right? And everybody knows that that's what it's about. In reality, you have these two things that people consider to be universal truths, and yet they're really based on geography, generation, etc. Right? And so sometimes those social truths, again, come up against people's personal truths, come up against people's forensic truth. Right? So thinking about how all of these align, you could have both of them together in your mind at the same time, right? Our minds are crazy and interesting places. And then last but not least, we have reconciliatory truth, or sometimes it's called restorative truth. And in that, we're talking about the narrative that contributes to remedying a perceived injustice. And I say perceived injustice just because it is about perception, right? An individual's lens, less about giving it a positive or a negative connotation. The thing with reconciliatory truth is that when you remedy something for one group, you may in fact cause an injustice or a perceived injustice for another group. And so you all see that Robert E. Lee statue as the picture there. That when it was erected, there was a group of people who thought that it was doing one thing in terms of remedying an injustice, as folks are desiring to take it down, right? They're thinking that they're remedying an injustice as well. So there's a lot of depth and a lot of complexity to the four truths that I just gave you. My point here is giving you something to think about a little bit later as you're thinking about your plans, but also recognizing that we need to meet people where they are. And so sometimes if you are so inclined to forensic truth, you may not be thinking about people's personal truths. If you are so aligned with a particular social truth, you may not be acknowledging people's reconciliatory truth, just as examples, right? So as we are thinking about this in terms of recognizing where people are and how we need to meet them where they are, do we have any questions before we move forward past that shared understanding of language? How is this resonating or not resonating with folks in the moment? Please feel free to put some things in the chat box, just as a temperature check here. How are we feeling? One positive from Michael. Thank you. Good. All right. So the four truths, just from the few that I've gotten back so far, seem to be resonating. Again, some people are more comfortable with that idea than others. We also didn't go into what does it mean to be a fact versus truth, right? There's a lot that we could talk about, but just this recognition that when we are thinking about what we're presenting and how we're presenting things, that we recognize that it is coming through our own lenses, it's coming through our own truths, it's coming through our own biases, right? All right, perfect. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time, just a few minutes, talking about something called emergent strategy. If I remember my next slide, self-awareness. Leading through agility. Okay, so when I'm thinking then about self-awareness and leading through agility, which will lead to emergent strategy, I have a couple of things here. And so this too, I want you to build on as you're thinking about creating your plan, because your action plan should be to the detail, to the extent that you are creating your strategic plan and everything else, right? You should have measurable goals, you should have clarity, you should have objectives, all of those things. And so when you lead through agility, thinking about the accountability culture, how are you going to make this accountable within the culture of your organization? Because a lot of times people think about DEAI as a soft skill or as something that's kind of just generally out there. So how are you going to hold people accountable to this space? That's really important. Next, empowering people at all levels. So I'm sure that some of you have already created or have been thinking about creating a DEAI or DEIA or IDEA, whichever order you go in, thinking about creating a committee. Sometimes those committees work really well. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult. The point here, I think the intention of those committees is to empower people at all levels. And so how are you going to do that within your plan? How are you going to start that for your organization? Next, agreements depend on integrity. So when I'm working with organizations and I do assessments and I come back and I say, there's a lack of transparency, there's a lack of communication, there's a hierarchy that's really problematic, there are problems with trust. And then sometimes the leadership team comes back to me and they say, that has nothing to do with DEAI. Stay focused. Those have a lot to do with diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, right? You can't actually have these conversations unless you're coming at them from a place of integrity. You can't be working with your staff unless you're thinking about transparency and communication and trust building. So how are you going to incorporate that, right? Very practically speaking, into your plans? And then pulling out that trust equation a little bit, thinking about trust building means having credibility, having reliability, and having intimacy or self-orientation. So that last one is really just back to that awareness of where you are, what biases you might be struggling with in the moment, right? Being in line with your feelings when something feels uncomfortable. The second one, being reliable, knowing that you're going to stick in there even if it's uncomfortable in the moment. And credibility, saying the things that you're going to do, doing those things, not saying too much about yourself or too little, right? A lot of organizations had that problem over the summer with their solidarity statements, that they were trying to say that they had done way more than the community would give them credit for, or that they were doing something really broad or weak, right? Okay. So as we are moving through this space and thinking about agility and trust, Justine just put something into the chat box about including justice. I've seen a couple of people do that as well. And so I think it's really important, again, with that intentionality, to recognize what justice means, right? When we're thinking about restorative justice, when we're thinking about reparations, it's not necessarily a monetary thing, but justice means something really specific. And so if you want to put the J into this scenario, then how are you going to be a part of justice? And later we're going to talk about what you have control over, what you have influence over, and what you have an invested interest in. And so, Justine, if I don't bring it up then, feel free to bring justice back into that part of the conversation when we're thinking about what we have control over, what we have influence over, and what we have an invested interest in. All right. As we think about leading through resilience, when we talk about resilience, people think it's about bouncing back. But the truth-telling part, the acknowledgement part, is a big part of that resilience. So you have to figure out why you fell down in the first place. You have to acknowledge that falling down and what happened. And then you have to think about how you're going to pick yourself up and move forward. And so as we're thinking about resilience, you'll also see in this definition here that you're recognizing adapting in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, significant sources of stress. All of our organizations, in fact, the United States and in the globe, we are in this moment, right, where we're facing adversity, trauma, tragedy, sources of stress. So there is a collective sense of this. And so organizations who are more resilient and who are adapting can bounce back faster if they're thinking about what made them fall in the first place, why they fell, and how to move forward. The more you do that, the more you go through that cycle, the faster you can go. And then leading through empowerment. This can be both for individuals as well as for organizations, right? So I want people to come at this from wherever they feel most comfortable or why ever they came to this session in particular. You can think of prioritizing connections, relationships, and partnerships as an individual who is working through empowerment. You can think about it from an organizational level as well. How are you a convener? How are you a good partner? Take care of your mind, body, and spirit. When we think about that as an individual, sometimes it's easier than thinking about that from an organizational perspective, but this should be part of your action plan as well, right? So what does the mind of your organization look like? Some people have given examples of exhibition space, of publications, of white papers that people write, right? What is the mind, that strategic plan, that mission, that vision, all of that stuff. When you think about the body of your organization, it could be the physical people, the people who make up the organization. It could be about your physical institution or your organizational space. Think about for you what the body of your organization looks like. And then last but not least here, in terms of spirit, right? So this is often connected to morale or culture building. How do you take care of the spirit of your organization? Find your purpose. We're going to talk about this in a little bit as well, that sometimes people hold to their mission or they hold to their vision, but what is your purpose? Why do you actually exist, right? As an individual, as an organization. So for example, I see my purpose as an educator. I was a teacher in a high school. I do trainings all the time now, but I'm an educator. And so whether that's in the formal classroom, in nonprofits, in museums, in for-profits, my purpose is education, and specifically education in terms of equity and inclusion and anti-racism. So think about your personal, individual purpose. Think about your purpose as an organization. And then embrace that everyone is doing their best. This is sometimes a difficult aspect because we like to finger point at others, right? But if we embrace that everyone is doing their best, even if it's not the way that you would do it, or if you don't feel like they're giving their all, I think part of that is about mindfulness and intentionality in recognizing that people are trying, and that can help move things forward. All right. So any questions here? I'm going to break you all into breakouts in a second, but any questions about leading through agility, leading through resilience, or leading through empowerment before I give you all your task? Any questions? All right. For those of you who, again, are internal processors, I'm going to give you just a minute as I continue to talk. In your breakouts, I want you to be thinking about your purpose, your mission, your vision, and your values, and then connect those to the idea of action planning. All right, so I just put that there in the chat. I want you to think about what your actual purpose is, what your mission is, what your vision, what your values are, in connection to this idea of a DEAI action plan. Okay. You are going to be in groups of 6 to 7 people around there. And I'm going to give you, let's see, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to go ahead and talk about those things. And then we will come back. So you don't have a ton of time, be efficient with your time, but I'm going to give you some space just to talk to each other about how all of those things work with your action planning. All right, I will see you in 10 minutes. I feel like I always say one of my favorite parts of being a participant is getting to go into a breakout room and coming back. It's not nearly as much fun when you're on the other side. I'm just sitting here waiting for you all to populate back again. Just give it one more moment to make sure everyone is back. All right, so knowing that there are a lot of people and also that we've been talking for about an hour now, I want to give everyone a 5-minute break. So it's 2:55 now. We'll come back at 3 o'clock. But you do have one thing that I would like you to do either before you go on break, after you come back, in the midst of it. And that is really to write one thing that really resonated from your breakout group. So write one thing that really resonated from your breakout group at some point in the next 5 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. I may be talking to a void, but Susie, I see you. You're back. Wonderful. Thanks for joining me again. All right, if you didn't get a chance, just take a glance through our chat. There are so many wonderful insights, I think, that are in here already. So let's just take a moment to acknowledge all of the amazing and intriguing things that people have said in the chat box. All right. I'm going to share my screen again here. We'll go through another round of this, again, more specifically to action planning. And for those who are perhaps more familiar with the Guggenheim and what's been happening, you can help your groups out, but I'm going to try to give an oversight here. All right, so sharing my screen, our focus in this section is about action planning. I mentioned before, and I hope that this has resonated a little bit, There are things that we can control, things that we can influence, and things that we have an invested interest in. And so I think that sometimes we don't recognize the differences in those things, that we have agency, certainly. We have empowerment, of course. Some people feel that more than others. Some people have more leverage than others, depending on positionality. And so recognizing both from an individual point of view as well as from an organizational perspective, there are some things that you can control, some things that you can influence, and some things that you just have an invested interest in. And so, very quickly, let's give some examples for each other in the chat box again. When we're thinking about our organizations, and let's do it from the individual perspective inside your organization, knowing that you don't all know each other or what positionality you have, but what control do you have, right? So, in thinking about your particular position, what can you control within your organization? Let's just put some things in the chat box. What can you control within your organization? Aaron, thanks for being first here. Control your own ability. People are controlling their participation. Linda, I love that in terms of responding and speaking with coworkers. Can control yourself. Wonderful. All right. So now, what about what we can influence? What do you all think that you have influence over, though you may not necessarily have control within the organization? Influence over, but maybe not necessarily control. What can you influence, even if you can't control everything? Other coworkers come to people for advice. You can influence who is hired in your particular department. Lots of things coming in. How we communicate, being an ally, how you describe collections or put things in exhibitions, interpretation and stories. Great. The culture of the organization, I like that. All right, now, what do you have an invested interest in? It may not be something that you can control, it may not be something that you can individually influence, but what do you have an invested interest in within your organization? Great, these are coming in well so far. Desire to serve diverse communities, have a wider audience, thinking about artists that we work with, the culture of the organization, having a welcoming environment. This is great. Okay. So, when we think about what you can control, what you can influence, and what you have an invested interest in, that we were just giving examples from an individual level within an organization. I'm not going to go through all of the same things again, specifically from an organization to a community, but why don't you give an example in any of those three areas that would go from organization to community? What might your organization be able to control? What might your organization be able to influence? What might your organization have an invested interest in when it comes to the diversity of communities in which your organization lives? From an organizational standpoint, What might you be able to control, influence, or be invested in when you think about diverse communities in which your organization lives? Great, good examples coming in. Hopefully, these will be helpful as we move forward. Right. All right. As you continue with that, I'm going to take myself off of the share screen. We're going to talk about the Guggenheim now. Um, just by a quick raise of hands for those who I can see, how many people are familiar with what's been happening with the Guggenheim lately? And if not them in particular, what's been happening in art museums generally? Yeah, over the past few months. Great. Okay. Thank you for that visual cue there. So, as we're thinking about this as a case study, I'm going to put a Google Doc, a share doc into the chat for you. Basically, what I've done is I have created a timeline based off of a particular article. I've created a timeline that really looks at what has been happening for the past little bit, particular to the Guggenheim, the steps that were taken, paying attention to the timing, right? When it was like a couple months between things or when it was a few days between things. And I really just want you to use the case study in thinking about reaction and response, right? So when we react, we try to do something very quickly that will put us back in our safe zone, right? That we do something that is pretty instinctive. When we're thinking about response, the time period may still be short, but we're pausing enough to ensure that whatever way we reply is in line with our values. So sometimes we are doing things in reaction as organizations, sometimes we are doing things in response as organizations. So when I give you this share doc of the timeline, you can go through, and there are 3 different parts. I'm going to give you about 25 minutes, and you're going to stay in your group that entire time. They'll be different than your first group. I want you certainly to talk about part 1, part 2, just thinking about the reflection questions there. But really, part 3 is the one that has the link to their 2-year action plan. And so that's going to be the part that we focus in on. Right? So utilize, and if someone wants to just give a summary of what's been happening at the Guggenheim, you can do that rather than reading part 1 and part 2, but really focus in on part 3 for your 25 minutes. Are there any questions before I send you into those groups? Everyone know what you're going to be doing? Thinking about reaction, thinking about response, and thinking about how they created their 2-year action plan. All right? Oh, I almost forgot to give you the share doc. That would have been upsetting. Okay. Again, not everyone needs to get in there, but certainly for those of you who are tech savvy, you can get in and help other folks. Here we go for the next 25 minutes. All right, welcome back. Just bringing back the last few people here. Let's do the same thing that we did the last time, right? So in the chat box, I'm looking for things that resonated, things that you want to think more about. But here's the caveat, right? Again, this is not about judging an organization. I care less about that, right? Not about a debate. This is about what we can learn about ourselves and each other through experiences and gained knowledge. So as you're putting things in the chat box, what resonates with you about creating an action plan, things that lead up to action plans? What are you curious about? What do you need to think some more about? You're looking for practical thoughts about the case study. Charles, thanks. Oh, Sarah, thanks for being first. Charles, thanks for being second. Great point so far. Margaret, I love that. Marathon, not a race. You need benchmarks, that it's actionable, measurable. There are consequences. Things need to be prioritized. Resources need to be put behind these things. Margaret's giving Emmy credit for the marathon example. All right, great so far. So all of these things that we need to pay attention to, I think that action plans, DEAI action plans, can be really scary for people to think about, but probably, hopefully, you all have strategic plans already, right? You may already have departmental action plans. So you're following a pattern of things that you know. You're taking into account resources, you're taking into account people, right? Staff labor that needs to happen. You're taking into account getting the board involved and programming and how everyone needs to be a part of the process. The equity and inclusion work isn't just for the programming team or the education team or the visitor experiences folks. Every single department can have a piece in this action plan. I like Michael's comment here about the combination of pressure from within and outside. Great. Alia says, notice the absence of measurable goals. What role does creating those add to the plan? And for me, I think that it is important to have measurable goals because I think that people create these big ideas about what diversity is or lofty concepts that they agree to in theory, but then when it comes down to practice, that's really much more difficult, right? So for example, if you're doing an exhibition and you say, in terms of equity, we want to be providing a lot more resources to the Latinx community, then you actually have to consider and prioritize and put dollars behind different ways of using social media or different spaces that the Latinx community may be paying attention to. You can't just say, we want our target audience to be the Latinx community and then put your ad in the physical newspaper that you've been using for the past 25 years, right? So I think that measurable goals, those measures are really important to take it from people agreeing in theory to people acting. Yeah. Also, I think something that I'm seeing and hear from you all is a recognition, hopefully, that DEAI work is not extra to what you all have been doing, but it's really a part of everything, right? Like I said before, it's about communication. It's about transparency. It's about community engagement. And so it may feel like it takes a lot of extra thought, a lot of extra effort, a lot of extra time. But the more you do it, the more used to it you will get. And it's just kind of stepping up some of the things that you've already been doing with some of your other community members, right? Or some of your other donors or your board, for example. All right, so it is now 3:42, and I want to open up some space. I want to save a little bit of time to give you all a bump at the end. But let's say that we've got maybe 10 minutes or so for folks to ask some particular questions, recognizing that all organizations are different, you all have different needs. But as you were thinking about coming today and activating those DEAI plans, what questions do you have that might be helpful for everyone to hear answers to? You can feel free to write them in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute and ask them verbally, whichever makes you most comfortable. So resources for activating plans or making plans. There are a ton of plans out there. I actually think that the Met is a pretty good plan. The Guggenheim took a minute for them to get there, but once you start looking at examples of plans, you'll see that a lot of them are actually very similar if you get the detailed one. So I'm happy to send along some of those examples, but once you start Googling, you'll find that. I think that when you start looking at equity statements, that should be more like the executive summary of your plan, right? So that you have a statement, you've got some sentences, you've got these are the things that we're committing to, and then you have a whole plan that goes along with it. So I'd be happy to send some things along, but you can find some that are relatively good out there. Yes, Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi. I was just, I've been thinking, and one of the things that came up in the Guggenheim case study tied to your point earlier about what's leading through agility, the trust equation. And I worry sometimes that my own organization trust has been broken between the employees and the staff. And like I could see in the Guggenheim, I'm sure that was true too. How do you repair it? I feel like now people are, I feel like the upper management is more engaged. And how do you redevelop that? Because it feels like something we might need to have before we embark on this action plan.
Yeah, I think that doing the internal work, that truth telling, that acknowledgement of what has been done is really, really important in trying to rebuild back trust. I think that having listening sessions, having spaces where community members can give their thoughts about something without the staff or the senior team getting defensive about it, just a pure listening session where people can say what they want is big. I think that finding ambassadors out there, right, not just allies, but people who are willing to speak with and for you is really important to go into places where you potentially can't go in the moment. And then I really think that while it is about statements, it's about saying the thing and having integrity with that, it is also about the action. And so that goes back to the marathon, that you can't expect just because you do a Black History Month program every year that does much, right? Or so this is we talk about 7 generations, right? It's a 7-generation thing that we're doing here. And so to recognize that, but just taking it from the internal, saying the thing, going to ambassadors, sort of thinking about it like in concentric circles, and making sure that there's non-recurrence, right? Making sure that you're not doing something that will mess up all of the work that you're trying to do. So there you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Liz had a question in the chat. How do you get buy-in from a mostly white board on DEAI initiatives that were developed by more diverse, socially engaged staff? And there's a disconnect between staff and board priorities. So I think one of the things that is not not exciting to talk about is that most of us who are working in this space think about this as a moral imperative. And so we talk about it as being a moral imperative. And sometimes board members, I'll stereotypically say like development people, there are folks who think about this much more from a business or a risk state. And so being able to talk about it using their language, I think can be really helpful in this. I also go back to that beginning idea where we're talking about diversity being for everyone, right? That we're all a part of diversity, that DEAI, like the inequities harm all people, right? And so being able to speak to how even if you are not a person of color, for example, that doesn't mean that racism hasn't harmed you. And so there are a lot of great authors, there are a lot of great articles out there that can help with that. I like Lauren's 5 whys, that's good. Another question, either out loud or, okay, Sarah, do you have any advice or resources for that moral versus business language? I think that it can be pretty unique to organizations. Chris Taylor, who used to be at Minnesota Historical Society, has written a couple of things, so I can try and find those. So he really talks about it from both angles, both moral and business case, I think. So he would be a good place to start with. When you're thinking about the business language, I actually think that going outside of our field space can be really good, right? There's a journal, something called Diversity Inc. that is really for the corporate world, and talking about diversity from a corporate perspective. So I think I might go outside of our nonprofit space and our art space to really be looking at how corporations are talking about it, and that can give some tips there too. Yeah. How about one, maybe two more? Janet, go ahead.
We're about to have a discussion on partnerships, and some of our folks are, experienced with partnerships, but a lot of our folks are not. So they're nervous about who do they reach out to, how do they reach out, and also just the fear of accidentally, stepping in it, basically. So how do we sort of help talk them off the ledge to, and support them reaching out to their communities, and that maybe it's okay to make a few mistakes along the way, but, a thoughtful approach, advice we could give.
Yeah, I think one aspect, going back to the guiding principles, right, that be aware of your own discomfort. So I think that as adults especially, we're not very connected to our feelings. And so just practicing, being uncomfortable, how am I feeling, without running away from it is really important. Secondly, I think it is an acknowledgement that we all make mistakes. I make mistakes, fellow consultants make mistakes, like everyone makes mistakes. And so just, it's not if it happens, it's just going to be when it happens, right? So I think that is an aspect of this as well. And that goes back to the resilience. So we all know that we'll fall. How are we going to think about bouncing back? The other thing I think is that folks should treat each other the way that they want to be treated. And usually if we start with that, then hopefully we'll be okay, right? At least in the beginning aspects of that. And I guess my last bit is that the people that I know, speaking for myself, the people that I know who are reached out to, talking about all of the lenses, all of the identities that I hold, are usually happy to have a conversation and happy to work. So I think that sometimes the fear from the one side is a barrier, but it's a perceived barrier. There might be some skepticism, there might be some reticence, all of that could be true. But I also think that if you're coming genuinely, if you haven't made a ton of huge organizational mistakes before, that there's still a door that's open. Huh. How do you navigate trainings for the government when trainings like critical race theory are being banned? So I would first just really recognize what that ban means and what it means like technically and what it means in practice, right? Because in terms of that, I think it was an executive order. In terms of that ban, that was for federal agencies, which is a very specific group of people. And so some folks might use that to be like, well, we can't do this thing, even though it doesn't apply to them. And some folks may be like, oh yeah, that doesn't apply to us. So I use the National Park Service as the example that when I do work with them, some say we can't talk about anything political at all. And others say, we're going to talk about the things that we need to talk about. We may use some different words, right? So I think in terms of the federal agencies, in terms of the government entities or the organizations that you're talking about, there's still a very wide spectrum in terms of what people are or are not doing in connection to that. Yeah. Okay, one more. I'm serious about this. One more before I give some last tips and hints. All right, so you all are ready to go then. Good? You know where you want to be. Okay, feel free to, do you know how much DEAI training is happening in schools currently? This has to be happening early on. I will say that I think that that is sort of separate from the museum work that's happening, but I do know several consultants who work specifically with schools. I'm working with someone right now who is not only working with schools, lots of different types of schools, but he also is connected to Sesame Street, right? So I definitely know that it's happening from early education on, but that's a little bit separate from where I am. I don't know that it's happening in every single classroom, if that's kind of the question. All right, let me give you my last little screenshot here about commitment, right? This is the last bit. And so this is where I was talking about principles of emergent strategy. Adrienne Marie Brown, I think, is really interesting. She has these principles or these pillars. So she says, small is good, small is all. So start with something small and then it grows bigger and bigger, either through replication or that it just grows, okay? Change is constant. So recognizing that as we move forward, change happens over and over and over. And so just get used to that, right? Kind of like the fear of falling down or making a mistake. Change is going to happen. There's always enough time for the right work. Again, we rush things. We say we don't have time to talk to our community members, that kind of thing. So there's always enough time for the right work. You need to be good at planning. There's a conversation in the room that only these people at this moment can have. Find it, right? So recognizing the value of every particular person who is in the room, whatever that space is, like we talked about with all the lenses in the very beginning, that everyone brings valuable lived experiences, everyone brings knowledge, everyone brings expertise. So find that. Never a failure, always a lesson. Right? So how do we look at things more as opportunities, as teachable moments, as things that we can grow from? Can So stay true to yourself, reframe, realign, or recreate your plan, turn fear into opportunity, consistently work toward your vision, take care of yourself, keep perspective, and remember that this is a journey. Take that first step, then take another. Right? So again, as you're doing this, it could be on an individual basis of working within your organization. It can be from an organization to community basis. And these are really practical sort of checkmark things to think about as you're creating your action plan. And I will just leave this up for a second before I stop sharing my screen so that you all know how to get a hold of me. Sometimes people don't want to speak up in the group. Sometimes there's not enough time. Sometimes you think about something at 4 o'clock in the morning. So you all have my email address there. You've got my Twitter handle. You've got my website. We'll make sure that you get the slides as part of this as well. All right.